All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. I really mean welcome back. It's been a couple weeks since we were here to the Uncoder on Uncork's Twitch channel. The first of now soon to be multiple Twitch episodes. Quick plug before we dig into today's episode. I think it might even be tomorrow. You might have seen on social media. Dara, who we had on a few weeks ago, one of our directors of application engineering, is launching a brand new show on the Twitch channel called Technically Speaking. So please tune in, check out what she's doing, and every episode that she has along the way. So today's episode, though, we have someone who's worked very closely with Dara over the years, a very good friend of hers and a very good friend of mine, Kristen Stilwell. Kristen, why don't you say hi to everybody?
Hey everyone, I'm Kristen. Do you want me to introduce
Yeah. Give us
who I am? Cool. So I'm a principal application engineer at Uncork, which means that I build every day in Uncork. It's my job to build. It's my job to be, up to date on everything that we're doing and know how to use the platform to its fullest extent. I've been in Uncork. I will hit 4.5 years tomorrow, actually, exactly on the day. So back when we were, 15 people in a tiny little room, and now we're over 500 or something folks. So been building since day one and still building now.
Yeah, that's awesome. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. You weren't in technology prior to joining Uncork, is that right?
Right. I was not. I worked a little bit in the hardware world at the Genius Bar for a while, but my background is in like video production. I worked in fashion for a little while. I was a dancer for a long time. So my experience to kind of code or any kind of tech was a really cool, like MySpace, back in middle school.
Right. Yeah. And so now you're a principal engineer. And honestly, I mean, I feel like, so I joined, I guess, 6 months after you. If you're 4.5 years in a couple days, I'm 4 years in a couple weeks. So I felt like you were a principal engineer when I started, like from day one. I think that was basically what you were doing. So, tell us, because there's a lot of folks who look at low code and no code as a way to bring, people from, I don't want to use the term citizen developer, because I would say, at least for you, you're way more than that, right? But you weren't necessarily an engineer when you started. So talk to me and talk to, folks maybe in a similar position to you, how that transit, well, one, what drew you to this kind of a career? And then two, how the transition went.
Yeah. So for me, what kind of drew me here, right? Like right before this, I was working, I was an assistant designer for a women's evening wear line. And if anyone knows fashion, that world is, 30, 40 years behind us. We talk about, other industries being behind in tech. Everything was paper. Everything was done like hand to hand. There was no organization, which as someone who needs to kind of deal with pre and post production is a nightmare. So I'd already started to figure out, all right, how can I digitize things? Like, what's the best ways to kind of logically do these things, right? And I've always been a fan of, puzzles or brain teasers and stuff. So when Uncork was hiring, I had a referral. So someone said, well, if you're not, I kind of got bored in fashion at that point. So they're like, well, if you want something else, this company, it's only 10, 12 people, go in, interview, like see what happens, right? So I came in. My story is actually kind of funny because it was, again, back where there were only maybe 10 or 12 people. So I had about a 6-hour marathon interview with every single member of SLT, from like Gary all the way through Bassam and everybody else, asking me different kinds of questions, asking me my background and my experience. And then at the end of it, Gary just left me with a computer and the version of, form builder as it was, or designer as it was back in the day, and said, build me something. I was like, okay, sure. And one of the funny things that we'll get back to where I was, but a question that was asked during the interview at the time was, what do you know about insurance? A lot of the clients, our initial clients, were insurance companies. And if anyone's familiar with what happens when you turn like 27 and have to get off your parents' health insurance, my answer was, well, I know I don't have it right now. And that was it. And that, I think, one, shocked a little bit, but two, kind of added a little levity. So when they asked me to build something, I was like, I can't build them. I'm not gonna build a rater. I didn't even know what a rater was yet, right? Like, I didn't know what these were. So in my mind, I was like, okay, well, I have the ability, to take in addresses, or the ability to take in dates and things. I have decision components. I have all this reference data I can use. So I basically built your, Cosmos style horoscope app where you could enter in your birthday, you could enter in where you're born, do all that, connected it back to the decision component. It was like pulling all these things in, and then actually ask Gary a question kind of about, the wraparound birthday logic. which we sat and we tinkered with it together for like 10 minutes or something to get it to work. So I think in terms of the transition, I approached everything like that. And I think Gary kind of specifically saw like, okay, I like to use, and I don't know if this is the best way to say it, but while my background, right, my resume, my paper wasn't necessarily listed with qualifications for this kind of role, I was always capable of this kind of a role. And I think Gary saw that when I got hired. I mean, now we have, the amazing academy. We have all these courses and classes and certifications. My training was, again, they gave me a computer, they put me next to Gary, and he said, go apply for a credit card. He said, you don't have to get it, and then build what you just did. And that was my training. He goes, you'll sit here for 2 weeks. If you have a question, ask me a question. I think I asked like one or two, that's how we figured out, NG repeat or something was like that day where I was like, how would I, print this if it's variable and blah, blah, blah. And then I just jumped right into projects from there. So I think the transition is a little bit of, you just got to jump in with 2 feet, right? And really be confident in that, like, you know what you know and you know what you don't know, right? If you asked me what an API was at that time, I couldn't tell you. If you explained it, I'd be like, oh, okay, yeah, I get logically what that is and what that does, and now I can go build it.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think getting your feet wet is obviously the biggest thing. And yeah, what a journey since then. And I mean, you've touched like so many. You said, diving in and you didn't have insurance, you didn't know anything about insurance, I guess, really when you started. I imagine you probably know more about insurance now than you ever thought or ever wanted.
I know more than I would like to about insurance at this point. If I could offload some of that, that'd be great.
Yeah, and you know what? Like that's always something interesting when people talk about low code, no code. It's always about it's often about the business people getting closer to technology, right?
Mhm.
That's what's always key. And I always like to kind of flip it and say the technology people also get closer to the business.
Yeah.
And I've seen like when I used to write code, I mean, of course I would understand a little bit about whatever it was I was building, but I feel like the amount of financial services and insurance and other knowledge that I've gained by working in Uncork far exceeds the level of knowledge I got of other subject matters that I developed software before, more traditional.
Yeah. I think and a lot of that comes from, right, our kind of pre-development phase where we're in the room with the business. Like I've always been in that room during requirements gathering or just talking about, all right, what is it that you actually want to build, and walking through sometimes on questions that they haven't answered themselves. And as we do that, my intention is not to like, oh, I want to learn your business, I want to know everything perfectly. It's to figure out, all right, where are the logical patterns here? How can I translate this into, an application that's not going to be, completely bespoke, custom everywhere, right? Like how can I do things in a way that are repeatable and readable and understandable? And essentially, how do I take what seems like this giant complicated thing and boil it down to like a digestible level, right? Because at the end of the day, especially in a lot of these industries, I feel like we overcomplicate because we start attaching a lot of, use case and like anecdotal use case versus if you take a step back and go, all right, well, what really needs to happen here? What information do I have to take in? What do I have to do with it? And where does it have to go? Right. Those are like your 3 things. And doing that, right, you learn about the industries, you learn about the things that the industry, I don't think even realizes it doesn't know about itself. Yeah. And then you figure out how to build it.
Yeah, and that's so interesting. You said you sit often in the room with the customer or people at the customer, right, to kind of go through it. And I think about just in terms of like a typical technology organization, that might in many ways be the responsibility of maybe the research, design, and product functions, right? Mm-hmm. And then by the time it gets over to like an engineer, that's already kind of happened, and then you just get the output of it. Yeah. But so I'm almost hearing that like when you're at least the model that you're working within, which I imagine a bunch of teams developing an Uncork are, and things that Uncork facilitates is bringing the technology teams even closer and bringing the engineers even earlier into the process. So now your product, your design, your engineering, your QA is working even tighter with one another as well as with the business.
Yeah, I think that's definitely where we kind of can thrive and where we have an opportunity, right? Because we're in kind of the no code or low code area. Those of us who are, right, application engineers have to be able to speak to engineers, right? We have to be able to speak technically, especially if we're talking to back and Uncork the platforms or the engineers of what, we're seeing or what we need. But we need to be able to also speak, in layman's terms and explain these things to non-technical people to do that translation. And so, right, bringing us into the room and bringing us there earlier kind of cuts out all of the telephone that happens, where I know for a right, you'll think like normal development, you might get a requirement coming across your desk that you just walk through it, A to Z, and doesn't make any sense. If you find those gaps, right, there's always going to be gaps. Having to go all the way back then through your sixth level to get to the product owner just to ask a question that maybe again got mistranslated. It's so much easier. And one of the nice things I like, especially when we do co-builds, is getting to work directly with the folks that we've trained up from those companies on our platform. I've made a lot of really good friends and colleagues by just kind of building with an Uncork alongside them. They come to me for help. I make sure that everyone's like doing well. When you're up late because you can't figure out why that one data workflow is not working, and then you realize, oh, it's undisabled. Okay, we find those things for each other, and those are moments where I feel like, especially our customers, they're getting the most out of us, and for us, we're getting to really just get into the meat of it and build, and not have to be, worrying about all the confusion and the gaps and all these places where you're like, oh, I don't totally understand your business, so how could I do this for you, right?
Cool. So, I mean, some of the things you've described in terms of how you, engage with the customer, how you work on a team of engineers, that's a lot of how Uncork Digital is doing things. That's correct. So you sit within a function of the business called Uncork Digital.
Yep.
So tell us, we had Dara on, she talked a little bit about digital from a kind of a management level and some of the processes. I'd love to hear from you more about, well, one, how you see Uncork Digital, what it is for folks who maybe didn't see the other episodes, your role in it, and then kind of from a developer's perspective, from an engineer's perspective, what that life looks like in digital for anyone who may be, looking for other career opportunities.
Yeah, for sure. So Uncork Digital, essentially, we kind of, as I was saying before, right, the thing that I feel like I've always been Uncork Digital before we had Uncork Digital, which is that we are using the tool, right? We're using Designer, we're using what has been produced by Uncork and our lovely engineers on the side building the platform. And whether we're doing it to build, COEs on our own centers of excellences for different processes, or we're doing co-builds with clients or customers directly to build their solutions, we essentially are there with you as your engineers, right? We provide architectural guidance, we provide configuration guidance. Our teams are kind of broken out into those levels. I don't know if we've talked about, we use normally like agile method. So we have our sprint plannings, and we're developing in a normal development cycle. And like you said, you mentioned QA before, working closely with QA. So we're all kind of rolling in it, each of us with our own responsibilities and our own, skill sets involved. So a couple of different ways that I've gotten to work through, actually, especially with my role as a principal engineer, I am an independent contributor, which essentially means that my sole focus is building. Its sole focus is being the go-to resource on building, especially as a principal, right? Being there, helping to train up some of our junior resources, helping to train up our customers, depending on the projects that they're on. So I've worked across either, everywhere from being a sole resource for a customer with our expert services. We have certain customers that come in, they say, we're learning, we got this, but we just need someone there to make sure that, we're following best practices, or if we have questions, we can go to someone, which is kind of a big deal within my job, right? The idea of best practices and the idea of kind of passing along the techniques, or it's hard to describe what it is, but the way in like, right, there's 1,000 ways to build the same thing. It doesn't mean all of them are the best. And especially with newer configurators, right? They'll take a couple of tries to get to that best way. So my job is to, one, get them there a little bit faster, and two, make sure that along the way they're keeping track of those best practices, whether it's compliance, security, all the things that any developer would have to be responsible for. We put that responsibility or we share that responsibility across the entire build. So teams can be, 2 of us, teams can be 12 of us, teams can be, it'd be nice if it was 40 of us. It's not usually 40 of us, but you get what I mean, where we had these kinds of structures. We have checks and balances. So big thing, just like you would do code review, we do config review, which is a great learning opportunity, or even just a great opportunity to knowledge transfer, different pieces of this. A really cool thing that we do at Uncork Digital is really making sure that no one's working in a vacuum. We all kind of will share this information if someone needs backup or someone needs support. We have a great model in place that someone can step in, right? Whether it's you just need a break, whether you're on vacation, whether it's anything else. The way in which we build and by having these consistencies, we're able to move each other around easily.
Cool. So you mentioned you mentioned code reviews and best practices. I think they kind of relate to one another. So a lot of time config reviews, code reviews, I find they get into like rubber stamp mode, and I'm sure that you don't fall into that bucket. So with that being said, like what would you say, more like specifically speaking, what are some of the things that you look for in a configuration review, and maybe that aligns to some of the best practices that you have?
Yeah. So for me, when I go into I try really hard not to rubber stamp it. I do have some colleagues that I have, a certain level of trust where I am just kind of going in, doing a once over, making sure there's nothing glaring and moving on. But obviously with especially those who are still learning, we get a little deeper in there. And the first thing I look for is readability, essentially. When I hit your module, right, whether it's an API or a front end module, when I go top to bottom, do I understand everything that's happening here? Does it make sense to me at least? Like, what are the functions that are happening here? What order are they happening in? Are there typos in your, names? Things like that. Because my brain moves faster than my fingers, so I have typos everywhere. And I will ask other people, hey, can you just go check that I wrote like the word endorsement correctly? Because I probably spelled it wrong 1,000 times. So that's where I'll start. And readability is interesting because it doesn't mean that your module is simple, right? It's not that, oh, I walk in here and all I see is an initializer, a data workflow, a plugin, and that's it. Like, yeah, that's beautiful. It's clean. It's simple. But if I open up that data workflow and it is, 500 operators, there's an opportunity here. Even if it works, even if every one of those operators serves a purpose and is doing the right thing, I have no idea what's going on. Right. Even I always promote using grouping within your data workflows just to really drive the point home. Right. It would be almost like if you were writing a comment in your code, right? You can use those groups to kind of explain that, right? This is what this section is doing. This is what this, but again, breaking them out just because, and I used to be guilty of this, right? Once we got our hands on data workflows, we're like, yeah, we can do everything at once and we call it once and we're done. Someone else steps into my module a year later, they're not going to know what is going on.
Right.
So that's one thing that I definitely look into is pulling that out. Especially if it's APIs, looking for the security, best practices that we have, making sure things are set appropriately for server-side executions, making sure that you have error handling in there, right? The things that it's just like, all right, can I check this off your list? And then I'm going to jump in and see, all right, is this the fastest way to do it, right? That's when sometimes I'll start to ask questions. But if you can pass the readability test, I know we're in a good spot. And then I can get a little nitpicky. Same thing with the front end. If I open it up and I see everything on watch, I'm sending it back. And I'm going to tell you to fix that first. And then we'll come back and we'll look at how you're doing, right? Because that's performance, which is kind of the other pillar that we have when we're doing reviews.
Yeah. Yeah, no, readability is huge. I remember when I used to code, like I had syntax guidelines that I would force my team to follow. Like your curly brace must be on the same line as your if statement, not a line below it. And then you have to have X number of indents and no code wrapping or text wrapping. So like, yeah, the principles apply here. And I think Uncork by default or any kind of visual language helps to start. But to your point, I mean, it's very easy to put things in places that don't logically or visually and readably make sense. And I mean, it's huge just because you have to document less the more.
Right. Listen, I think we all agree across the board. No one likes doing documentation. It's not the fun thing, right? You do it, whether you do it before, you do it during, or you're doing after, right? It's the come down of the high of configuring, right? So the more you can kind of include it and make it just, easily discern from your config, the less work you have to do after. So you kind of win.
Yeah. So I guess you might have answered this next question earlier. Some of the things you said might come back to me. But all right, so you're at the top of the IC, individual contributor path, right? Principal is you are the principal of app engineering. How did you get there, and what advice would you give to other engineers, whether they're Uncork engineers or software, code engineers who also want to go toward a principal path. I mean, you've had a lot of success. What advice do you give to folks trying to get there?
Yeah, I think one thing for sure, and this is definitely, I know, especially with a lot of folks, that imposter syndrome like creeps its way in, but just really letting your work kind of speak for itself. That's one thing for me. Like, I mean, you know me, I can speak for myself very easily. I have no problem advocating for myself, but especially in those first few years, coming from not in tech into a tech space, I knew that there was going to be a little bit of a mountain or molehill to jump over to get people to kind of either trust or respect or recognize my ability to get me onto that path. So I just made sure, no faults could be found in my work. Or if I did find a gap, right, I immediately identified or sought help or sought, different resources. I know I bug you on Slack like every day for a long time, being Nick, what is this? What does this mean? What is this? And having no kind of bashfulness or shame about asking those questions. If you don't know something, you don't know it. And it's not worth trying to fake it or try to say, yeah, hold on. And then, shamble your way through it, because you're never going to actually understand it then, right? If you kind of murk your way through it, you're never going to get there. I think definitely too, something for me in the beginning, right? I mean, my history, even with Uncork, started off with a very specific function within config. Documents and PDFs were my jam, because at the time it was,
you were the PDF.
those were the OG solutions were all me, and that took up a lot of my first year or two. So that was a very specialized function, and I had to do, it was a need that needed to be filled, right? I had to do it. I did it really well. I helped to figure out the best practices. I helped to establish what we're where our gaps are, or what we need to look out for, how to gather like I got to do a lot of work in that. But I do remember when I finally was set free from my PDF closet, being a little intimidated, because there were all these other facets to config that I hadn't really gotten to touch yet. I learned a lot doing the documents, because it's all about data manipulation. It's all about, right, like file sizes. It's complex within itself, complex logics, but then taking that and applying it to maybe more of a workflow or more of, an API driven practice, things like that. So right when I got out, I realized, okay, I'm a specialist in this. That's great. I have it. Good. Let me go find something else, right? Let me go and start cherry picking, or at least pulling out the pieces that I know I'm weak at. And whether I take on, right, maybe a junior to somebody else to learn it, or it's new for everybody. I did that with some of our original third-party integrations. They said, hey, we need someone to figure out how we do this, how the best way to do this. I said, I'll do it. If none of us know, great, we're all starting at zero. Like, I'll figure it out. Yeah. That's how I learned about a couple of our, other third-party languages and skills. I mean, that's the skills section of my resume has more than quadrupled since kind of taking these on. So I think advice that I would give would be, if you don't know it, right, or nobody knows it, be the person to know it, right? Be the person to go find it, be the person to figure it out. Even if you do it and then you hand it off, right? Maybe you do hit a ceiling with it. What you learn in that time is more valuable than, trying to kind of fake your way through being the best right away.
Right. Cool. I mean, that's great advice, particularly the one that, I'll tell a lot of people it as well. Let your work speak for itself too. If you just continue to deliver and do so at a high quality, in theory, it will not go unnoticed. So that being said, let's talk a little bit about what you're delivering, right? And what you're working on now. So as I understand it, there've been, a little bit of a reorganization in digital to allow you to do some of the things that, I'll just let you tell us that you're going to be doing.
Yeah. So, right, we've had a little movement, and it's very exciting, because we've essentially made way for our group of powerhouses. It's myself and actually our principal solutions architect as well as a select little team. But what essentially we're working on is COEs, so centers of excellence, and accelerators. What we mean by COEs is kind of back to what we said before, how we know there's 1,000 ways to build, but there usually is still at least a couple that are the best way to do it. We're doing that, right? We are taking more than just simple functions, but instead kind of larger concepts that we've seen, our current customers want, we've seen the market want, we've seen kind of the need for solutions that are fully baked, fully tested, like ready to go, easily read, right? Very readable, things that you can kind of just, you build it and you can hand it and it's going to work for you, right? And whether you use that as a starting point or you change it up to work for your use case, we're going to give you things where you don't have to start with the blank page, right? I think this goes across for every medium, whether you're in the arts, whether you're in tech, that first blank page of whether it's code or paper or whatever can be daunting. So our team is working to kind of make up for that and build these things out while continuing to support them, right? So that's kind of a really cool feature we're working on, is essentially allowing versioning. So we would build it, we release version 1 over the course of time. If we, either come up with an even better way to do it that improves performance, or we have a new feature that's been requested, we're going to do that. And if you're already kind of involved, or if you want to pick it up, you'll get that release if you want it. Accelerators, we're even building things to help you build. So there are a lot of Gesundheit. There are a lot of things that you'll feel yourself kind of building repetitively, right? Like we know this. There's always the thing you're like, oh, I did this over in that project. Oh, I'm going to go get it and bring it here and change it, or I can do this function. So finding those pieces, and then again, kind of building them. And one of the cool things that we get to do, because we are a small team and we can kind of move around, we are going to all of our other groups and kind of gathering their insight or gathering their expertise in things. So myself as an engineer, I'll go to our app leads, I'll go to our app engineers, I'll go to that team and say, hey, what are you seeing? We're in the platform every day. Dump on me everything you have about it, so we can kind of consolidate it. Our SA will do that with the SAs. We'll talk to, the community. We'll talk to our client teams. We'll talk to our engagement manager, everybody, to kind of bring all that information in and be the pot or whatever, right? However you want to cook it together to build these solutions. So we can essentially, ideally, rather than, working on one thing, building for one person or one customer and handing off one solution, we can build, and many people, many groups, many, internal, external developers or creators can use them, and hopefully, make its building exciting.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, you want the best of the best doing that, especially if it goes out to all our other customers. So that's pretty exciting. Do you have any examples you could share of some of the things that are at least on your roadmap or that you may be currently working on?
Trying to think what I'm allowed to share. So we're brand new and we're trying not to get too ahead. We're planning our things out, trying not to get too ahead of ourselves.
We'll just announce it on live
television. I know. I'm waiting to see my Slack pop up and stuff. Which one can I talk about? Oh, okay. So I can say, okay, this is fine. Back to my roots of documents, actually, we are working on creating a holistic solution for any of your, especially document signing needs. I know that a lot of people, right, when you're building applications, there are still PDFs that someone needs to sign, regardless of what e-sign, you're going to use to do it. And I know we have some marketplace things available for specific, different third parties that people have worked with. We are looking for a way that makes it super user-friendly, super easy for you to just be able to go in, select the service that you're using, right? Select exactly which documents you're sending, and then it'll take care of the rest of it for you. So you don't have to mess around with, building envelopes or making double calls or figuring out all your, crazy authentic, is the file binary or base64? What size is it? All that, all the things that you shouldn't have to keep doing over and over again. So that's exciting.
I mean, it sounds like the way you just said that, you don't have to worry about the file type and even the provider. I mean, it's almost like you're building an SDK for that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Right? Yeah, 100%. That is really where we're focused across the board, right? And any of these functions that we're doing is kind of taking out as much of the legwork as possible and just allowing you to kind of set your parameters or set your definitions, right? Have a couple of customizable preferences. And ultimately, at the end of the day, if you really wanted to, right, you could take that as a jumping off point. That's the other kind of nice thing too, is when we're putting these things out, they'll be out with, full documentation. They'll have been QA, they will have been performance tested. They will have our official stamp on it. So you can go in and look at that config, right? If you're like, ooh, this accelerator is doing something and I want to do something similar, how would I? You have access to see those modules. You have access to see exactly how we did it with documentation kind of explaining it throughout. So I think that's kind of the other part of this. It's going to be nice is it's even like an extension of our, academy, an extension of a learning opportunity, especially if you're, like a self-learner.
Sure. I love the approach. Cool. All right. So I know you can't talk too much more about those types of things, but you did tell us yesterday that you were working on something pretty cool recently that you can share. That I think if you want, we'd love to throw up and show us what this cool thing is.
Okay, so I can tease it and we can do it in part 2. At this
All
moment,
right.
at this moment where it's located, I can't show it.
Yeah.
But we did have this was and it was something that I had to do for before all the kind of pod stuff happened. So I'm excited to potentially bring it in and get more eyes on it and make it better. But essentially built like Twitter, kind of your little feeds and being able to tag people and comment back and liking it. I'm working on adding more than just likes, so you could, thumbs up it, thumbs down it, little poop guy, whatever you want. We're working on making it like emoji friendly. Yeah, but that might be, we have to wait till part 2. I tried to get it into somewhere where we could show it, but I unfortunately was a little busy.
All right, cool. Well, you know what then? I think this is a great place to stop with to be continued cliffhanger episode. Make sure folks come back maybe as soon as next week, but we'll definitely get you back soon to go through that. But in the meantime, thank you so much for coming on today, hearing more about your story and just what you're doing here at Uncork. Any parting words before we sign off and then leave people hanging?
I think just that Nick pulled the wrong Stilwell background behind him.
Oh, yeah.
I think that's my last words. We are not the same as the street in Brooklyn.
That's right. Yeah. So you folks who've been watching know I like to make my background apropos for the episode. We're with Kristen Stilwell, and Stilwell Avenue is the stop on the F train, right, that goes to Coney Island, where the cyclone is. But I learned today that there is a different spelling, and there is no relationship.
It's very different families.
But you're a native New Yorker, right?
I am 6 generations.
All right.
We've been here, yeah. But as they would say, before the bridges were built, we've been here. All
right, cool. Yeah. So I am thinking you were like, your family was like running this town in South Brooklyn, but you're still cool in your own right, even if you're not the double L still. So. All right, cool. Well, thanks again. Thank you everyone for joining. Thank you, Kristen, for coming on, talking. We're excited to have you back for part 2 to see this Twitter app. All right, good stuff. And make sure to tune in again tomorrow. Do we know what time tomorrow's episode is? Technically speaking,
11 a.m.
11 a.m. All right, tomorrow 11 a.m. right here, twitch.tv/Uncork. Check out the debut episode with Dara Askin and Technically Speaking. Thank you again, Kristen. Thank you again, everyone, and have a great afternoon.